Many factors shape the ways that people think and act. Social location, communal or personal experience, technology or material culture play a part, as well as religious teaching. Here we will look at the theological and historical background which shaped the attitudes on race of white Presbyterians in the southern United States who initiated missionary work in Congo in the late 19th century. There are 3 parts and a conclusion. 1. John Calvin's preaching and teaching. 2. English colonists in North America. And 3. The biblical and religious ideas characteristic of white Southern Protestants in the immediate post-Civil War period. Part 1. John Calvin was not the only source of Reformed theology in the 16th century, but he was a key and influential voice. It is therefore worthwhile to sketch his basic teaching about how human beings should live together, and then what he said about slavery in his preaching. The foundation of Calvin's theology was his understanding of the Bible. The law is summed up in the 2 great commandments, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Calvin saw these 2 commandments as tightly interwoven. The worship of God is first, but loving the neighbor is another expression of loving God, and sometimes how we treat our neighbors is better evidence of worship than the outward acts of a Sunday service. Obeying the 10 Commandments means much more than just following the words literally. When it says, "Do not kill," it refers to the most obvious form of violence against my neighbor, but the word stands for any kind of harm. Furthermore, to keep the commandment as God intended, we have to give our neighbor's life all the help we can. Keeping God's law is not simply refraining from doing harm. We must actively do good. But who is my neighbor? Calvin insists that God created all human beings in God's image, and that means every person is my neighbor. Even if that person has done me wrong, I have to recognize Christ in that person. This does not mean making myself a doormat. It does not mean rejecting social ranks in society. But it clearly requires Christians to regard every person as equally part of the same human family, with the same God-given nature. Explaining Matthew 5:43, Calvin exclaims, quote, "It is amazing that the scribes had fallen into the absurdity of restricting the word neighbor to one's friends, since there is nothing more clear or sure than that God embraces the whole human family when he speaks of our neighbors." End quote. Now let's look at what Calvin was saying about slavery. He does not discuss this as a theological topic in his Institutes of the Christian Religion or Catechism, but he treats it in relationship to explaining the biblical texts which deal with slavery. Preaching on such texts as Deuteronomy 15:11 following, Genesis 12:4, 1 Timothy 6:1-2, or 1 Corinthians 7:21-23, Calvin explains that the biblical practice was regulated by God to prevent harm to slaves, and this domestic servitude was very different from the slavery practiced in the ancient world, which we would call chattel slavery. In preaching on 1 Corinthians 7, Calvin says that slavery had passed away so completely that there was no longer a word for it in French. The only term he could find was serf, people bound to the land, because the concept was known to his congregation, even though the practice was almost gone from Western Europe. The only servants Genevans knew were persons who had contracted to serve for a period for certain wages. The closest analogy to ancient slavery that Calvin could find in his own day was slavery in the galleys, ships which used oars as well as sails. The oars were manned by slaves who were chained to their benches, usually until they died. Calvin, in fact, knew someone who had been a galley slave. When John Knox was illegally captured, he was forced to serve as a galley slave for 18 months until a powerful lord arranged his release. Mostly this form of slavery was practiced by pirates in the Mediterranean. Calvin knew that the Spanish did this, but he never mentions the American slave trade, so it is not clear whether he knew of it or not. To summarize, clearly Calvin accepted that there was slavery among the people of the Bible, but he also praised God that in his own world of Northern Europe, this had been left behind so long ago that the concept of chattel slavery had disappeared from the language. He distinguishes the biblical institution from the classical world. Calvin emphasizes that everyone among believers are required to treat each other primarily as people made in the image of God. Without condemning the patriarchs, he sees the historical change away from their practice as a very real improvement. Part 2. Calvin might rejoice that slavery was gone from his context, but it was not gone from Europe as a whole. Various forms of enslavement were practiced in southern Europe, particularly around the Mediterranean, and Spain and Portugal had introduced it into the Americas. Northern European countries did not introduce African slaves into their territories until around 1620. In these places, the closest approximation to slavery in Calvin's day was indentured labor, a form of contract service. A destitute person might agree to be an unpaid servant for a shorter or longer period of time in order to have a means to live. In England, poor men or women who wished to go to the American colonies could work as unpaid labor in exchange for their passage, and then they would be free to live their own lives. In fact, however, the people recruited to be indentured in the English colonies were frequently those poor, unemployed vagrants who were gathering in the rapidly growing cities like London, people whom the ruling class wanted to get rid of. They rounded them up and sent them off to be sold to colonists for a stipulated period of service, sometimes even several years. When these social rejects, or sometimes criminals, were brought to North America, they were often treated with much greater harshness than indentured servants in England. The first load of Africans who were forcibly brought to Virginia in 1619 were treated as indentured servants, because the first English in North America did not bring a theory of slavery with them. However, that changed when they saw the sheer amount of uncultivated land. They determined to exploit it, and for that they needed laborers, lots of them. Very soon, at least by 1650, the English in North America had instituted slavery. One form of it was enslavement of Native American war captives. Puritan minister John Eliot was the first person known to have written a treatise against the age-old justification for enslaving captives. He protested against the transportation and sale of Native Americans to slavery in the Caribbean. But no one was listening, and the focus had already moved from indigenous peoples to Africans. By 1700, slavery was established in all the English colonies. The majority of slaves were concentrated in the South, many on small farms where they worked with their owner's family. A great many, of course, were also on large plantations, but a white man did not have to be rich to own a family of slaves. The North had similar small farms with their slaves, but the North's main contribution to slavery was shipping, transporting captives from Africa. Part 3. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the common white view was that slavery was wrong, but it was an economic necessity. The prosperity of the colonies and then the new nation depended on slave labor. There was a general assumption that slavery would eventually fade away, and it was in fact becoming increasingly unprofitable in the later 18th century. All that changed at the turn of the 19th century. One factor was the invention of the cotton gin. This suddenly made slave labor far more important because cotton could be processed so much faster, and therefore more cotton meant more money. The other factor was a shift in religious views of slavery. Some people began to attack it as entirely wrong, others to defend it as biblical and thus inherently right. Presbyterian theologians like James Henley Thornwell were among the most outspoken pro-slavery voices. Their theological basis was a literal reading of the Bible, which concluded that because Abraham and other patriarchs had slaves, and because Paul did not require Philemon to free Onesimus, slavery was a divinely acceptable institution. Furthermore, this interpretation did not recognize that chattel slavery was significantly different from the practice of the biblical figures. The Confederate defeat in the Civil War ended the practice of slavery in its old form. However, scholars have argued that military defeat did not end the theological conviction of many Southern Christians, including Presbyterians, that the institution of slavery was still biblically valid. Southern theologians continued to see white people as superior to blacks and to regard themselves as responsible for the freed slaves in a paternalistic fashion. Attacks on Southern pro-slavery ideas by Northern theologians who were beginning to read the Bible with less literalist ideas and or who recognized that chattel slavery was not what Scripture was talking about, only confirmed the Southerners in their interpretation. It also convinced them that the Northern liberals were not orthodox because they had abandoned biblical authority by declaring that slavery was a sin. It was in this paternalistic siege mentality of the Reconstruction period that Southern Presbyterians began to think about missions to Africa. The white Christians did not regard the freed slaves as their equals. At best, they were to be ruled for their own good and kept under white supervision.